Sunday school leader. Hey, I am visiting my daughter and her family in Clemson, South Carolina. We're having a great time. This here is grandson Henry. He's 7 years old. Grandson Charlie is going to be 5 in just a couple of days. He's upstairs running around like a 5-year-old does. So anyway, I've asked Mr. Henry here if he would introduce our lesson this week. Henry, tell us what's going on.
We are starting a new unit this week. It is called Living Life Connected to Christ. This will be the first lesson in that unit. It is titled Life of Humble Service. The lesson text is from John chapter 13, verses 3 through 10 and 14 through 16. The point of the lesson is we reflect Christ when we serve others with humility.
That's right. We do reflect Christ when we serve others with humility. And so here when we're getting done with this prep talk video, I'm going to serve these young grandsons with humility. All right, I think that's good.
Well, thank you, boys, for helping me with that introduction. Hey, I'm going to start off by telling you a story that I have told before. It seems like it wasn't that long ago, but it fits in so well with this week's lesson. In June of 2003, we moved from Kansas to north central Arkansas. And my dad had just been diagnosed with thyroid cancer just a few months before. And you know what? There's a 99% recovery rate. And he went through radioactive iodine treatments. He had part of his thyroid removed, and he just kept losing weight. Well, in October of that year, things weren't looking too good for him. He was in the hospital off and on. And on Tuesday, October 14th, I traveled down to Little Rock to spend the day and the night with him there in the hospital. And that night, we had a great visit. You know, we had a good relationship. We talked about the things he wished he had done, and you know, some of the highlights of his life and all that. You know, it was a long night. It wasn't very restful. He would be hot, then he'd be cold, and he just went back and forth. So I went back to my home in north central Arkansas that next morning on the 15th, and then I got a call from my mom early on Thursday morning on October 16th, and she said things really aren't looking too good. You might want to come back. It was about a 3.5-hour drive from where I was to Little Rock. And so I'd just taken Sarah to school, and she was in early doing marching band. And I thought, do I pull my daughter out of school? I don't know. And so we traveled down to Little Rock. We stopped and ate lunch and all that. Well, he died about the time we'd parked the car in the parking lot of the hospital. And by the time we got up to the elevator, got on the elevator, got up to the 10th floor, Mother was there and said, no, he just passed away about 10 minutes ago. Well, those of us who have lost loved ones, we remember those last conversations that we had. And just like I remember the last conversation I had with my dad. And I think about that conversation more so than any other conversation I had with him because it was the last one. Now, let's go back 2,000 years. Can you imagine if you had spent 3 years following a man whose birth story was somewhat suspect? And he was different. He was more than just a man. He was more than just a prophet. He did miracles. And he shamed the religious leaders of his day. And he always seemed somehow to escape harm. But now this man, this Jesus, was proclaiming that not only did he have to go away, but he was going to be handed over and put to death. And Jesus told his disciples, his followers, what would be happening to them. And so this is one of those last conversations Jesus is going to have with his disciples. And after he died and was buried and resurrected and then ascended into heaven, don't you think those disciples would remember those last words he had with them as they ate that last Passover meal together, just as I can remember that conversation with my dad? Well, thank goodness we can eavesdrop on that conversation thanks to God's Word. Well, in John 12 through 19, chapters 12 through 19, that's all those chapters, that's the last week of Jesus' life that's recorded. That's a significant portion of this gospel dedicated to those 7 days. And a good portion of those chapters are red letters, right? That's when Jesus is talking. A lot of it's Jesus' teaching, especially to his disciples. And so in this unit, we're going to be looking specifically at 6 passages in John chapter 13 through 16, living life connected in Christ. And this week in John 13, it's the story of the Last Supper and the foot washing. the example that Jesus gave his disciples. And when we visualize this, we usually probably think of that famous Leonardo da Vinci painting. But that's not how meals were eaten back then. More likely, it was more like a U-shaped table. They were reclining on some pillows or mattresses, propped up on their left elbow, eating with their right hand. And this would have made access to the disciples' feet easier as we think about that in our story. Let's think a little bit about the historical context here, the cultural context. They lived in an era, this first century Palestine, about who was the greatest. And we might look back on them with a little judgment and think, well, that's odd. They probably should have been a little bit more humble. But, you just have to remember who they were in that time frame back then. They constantly questioned who is the greatest in any situation, who deserved more honor. In the synagogues, there were those elders that were seated at the chief seats on the platform. In Matthew 23, Jesus rebuked those who coveted those seats. In Luke 22, verses 24 through 30, there's another account of the Last Supper. And even here in this account in Luke, there was a dispute about who is the greatest, right here at the Last Supper. And so Jesus is getting ready to break down that cultural belief about, who's greatest and who's less, and I don't have to do things because I'm greater than you. He's going to break that down. Well, in verses 3 through 5 of John chapter 13, we see that Jesus knows exactly what's going on here. He's been warning the disciples off and on during his ministry. I'm going to be betrayed and then handed over. I'm going to die. And they didn't get it. And Jesus knew his time on earth was coming to an end. It was getting pretty short. So he wanted to teach. He wanted to tell them what to do to carry on the work. We know the best way to teach is by example. I said this in a Sunday school lesson just a few weeks ago. Sam Walton, founder of Walmart, said, never lead from your chair. Right? Never just sit down and tell people what to do. You lead by example. And Jesus did that. He led by example. He wanted to teach them how to be humble servants to one another, because that was Jesus' nature. He was a humble servant. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8 reflects this, that Jesus, he was in the very nature of God. He made himself nothing. He took on the very nature of a servant, humbled himself, and was obedient to death. So in our story in John, what did Jesus do? He got up from the table, took off the outer robe, wrapped a towel around his waist. He wore the towel. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. He wore the towel. Now, can you imagine what the disciples were probably thinking? What in the world is he doing? Right? Then he poured water into a basin and he began washing their feet and drying them with that towel that he had around his waist. Well, most of your longtime church-going members, they're going to know this story, but some may not, okay? The traveling was done, of course, by foot most of the time. Sandals were worn, dusty roads, ends up having dirty feet. So foot washing was common both in the Greco-Roman culture and in Jewish culture. Now, foot washing was usually reserved for the lowest servant at the house. A wife might wash her husband's feet. A student might wash his teacher's feet, but never the other way around. Never. It just wasn't. It was not the cultural thing to do. In fact, some Jewish sources state that this was such a lowly task that Jewish servants were exempt from the act, and it was reserved for Gentile servants. So for Jesus to do this went against the culture, but that's really who Jesus was, wasn't it? He went against the culture. He broke through those cultural norms to teach truth. Now, Jesus took off that outer garment, put on the towel. When he did that, he's putting on the posture of a servant. And he's getting ready to act out a parable, to physically act out a parable by performing a physical act that's going to have a spiritual significance. And being that Jesus knew all, he knew that Judas was going to betray him. He knew that Peter was going to deny him. He knew that every disciple was going to desert him. All this in a few hours. Yet he still humbly washed their feet. So Jesus went around the table, washing the disciples' feet, drying them off with a towel. And I wonder, did they even notice who was doing it? Maybe they were just dumbfounded. But it appears that nobody spoke up until Jesus got to Peter. And we see that exchange in verses 6 through 9. Peter says, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus says, you don't realize what I'm now doing, but later you're going to understand. And Peter says, no, you're never going to wash my feet. What does Jesus say? Unless I wash you, you're going to have no part with me. Then Peter comes back and says, well, then, Lord, just not my feet, but my hands, my head as well. And so we see here Peter's attitude change in an instant from what appears to be this humility for show, right? Nobody else objected, but I'm going to. It went from that to a complete acceptance of what Jesus was doing. You want to wash my feet? Fine. Now wash all of me, if that's what you want, Jesus. And here's where Jesus puts that spiritual twist on this physical parable. We see this in verse 10, and this is used as a support for eternal security of the believer. That when Jesus cleans you, okay, spiritually speaking, when he cleans you, what? You're saved. And that's like taking a bath. Okay, you're clean, head to toe, you're clean. But as you journey through life, you're going to get dirty. You're going to sin. Just like walking on the dusty roads, you're going to get your feet dirty. But you don't have to take a whole bath again to get your feet clean. You don't have to keep taking that bath over and over that day, right? You don't have to do that. So when you sin, you don't have to get saved again, but your feet are going to get dirty. And when they're dirty, they're going to mess up the furniture. They can stink. They can be offensive to others. And so the sins you've committed after salvation, they can have consequences. They can be offensive to others. But you don't have to get resaved. You just need to confess those things. Just get that spiritual foot washing and get on with life. Well, in verses 13 through 16, Jesus turns this back on them and says, you call me Lord and teacher, and that's great, because that's who I am. But I am above you in that hierarchy of things, and I've washed your feet, the feet of my disciples. That was unheard of. Now that I've done that for you, you go and do likewise. And if I did this as your Lord, as your teacher, there's no reason you can't do this. No one should think themselves above serving another. Humble service. That's the mark of a disciple of Jesus. In Matthew 25, we see that talk about the sheep and the goats. And in verse 40, it says, whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. So when we serve others, we're not only reflect Christ, we're also ministering to Christ. Now, about that towel, my best friend in college was and probably still is, a diehard Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And I know there are other teams, college teams and professional teams that do this, but at that time, the only ones I knew of that had this towel. It's called the Terrible Towel. His was black and had gold print on it that said Terrible Towel. And they would take and twirl that thing around, during the game. And here's the thing. Most of us want to take up the towel. And we want to be prideful. But Jesus didn't take up the towel. He put on the towel. So that's what we need to do. We need to follow Christ's example. We need to not take up the towel and be all prideful. We need to put on the towel and be humble servants. Well, I'm going to get back now to enjoying some grandson time here in Clemson for a few more days. So don't forget to pray for and with your class. I really appreciate you guys for watching.